Okay.
She didn't.
Welcome, everybody. Good to see you. And if you
didn't.
don't mind muting yourselves until you have a question to ask or something like that, that would be great. This week we're talking about The Chosen, which was released back in 1981. So it's a pretty interesting film, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. It's rare in a certain sense. I mean, we haven't seen even movies that we've about Jewish content and so forth. It's pretty rare to see a movie that's entirely within a Jewish milieu. The one we watch for next week, The Quarrel, is similar in regard. But other than that, I mean, they're few and far between in a sense, where where the characters are Jewish, the stories all about things going on within Judaism. To a large extent, the only other movies that really into a category like that are like Fiddler on the Roof and Yentl, right? Otherwise, they're almost always Jews in a larger context, right? In the context of the secular world, like Gentleman's Agreement or even Body and Soul last week. So this is a bit unusual. It makes it probably pretty high on our sort of Jewish Hall of Fame list, for it's based on a novel, his first novel, Chaim Patak, whose name we already know. He was this story probably has a bit of personal biography in it. I mean, he was raised in a Hasidic family in New York and Philadelphia. He rebelled of going all the way to Yeshiva University in New York, right? So he went from the two poles we see, which we may think of as being rather close together, of Hasidism and modern Orthodoxy. Eventually, he got his ordination at the conservative seminary, the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania. So it's his first book. It actually won the Edward Lewis Wallant Award. I don't know if you remember this from a few weeks ago, but the author who wrote the book that The Pawnbroker was based on was Edward Lewis Wallant, who died young. I'm not sure if my memory, I think of a brain hemorrhage. So an award was established in his honor for books of Jewish. And so The Chosen, actually, in the year that it came out, won the Edward Lewis Wallant Award. Let's talk about the director for a moment. There's a guy named Jeremy Kagan. We're actually going to take a look at another one of his movies in a couple of weeks called The Big Fix. He was born in Mount Vernon, New York. His father, I believe, was a rabbi. He graduated from Harvard University and made a few movies over the years. He won, but he's directed many television shows. He won an Emmy a few years back for his direction of an episode of Chicago Hope. And he actually won the Gold Prize at the Moscow Film Festival a number of years ago for a movie called The Journey of Natty Gann. He's made films with Jewish characters in them, and including Golda's Balcony, which maybe you've seen as a Tova Feldsha played it on Broadway. I'm not sure if she repeated her role in the movie or not, but based on the life of Golda Meir. And so Jeremy Kagan directed that movie. I know there's a movie out about the Chicago 7. Before this movie that year, Jeremy Kagan directed a movie called Conspiracy, The Trial of the Chicago 8. As I mentioned, The Big Fix in a few weeks. So no stranger to directing movies with Jewish content, Jewish characters. So I felt very close to this material as well, having come from a pretty traditional home himself. He actually, in addition to director, he also works as a professor. He's currently the head of the directors program at the University of Southern California Film School. Not doing that back in my day at USC, but interesting to know that so that he spends a fair amount of his time. The screenplay was adapted by a guy named Edwin Gordon, and it's hard to find any information. This appears to be the only screenplay that he worked on, which can only mean that he felt close to the material and wanted to do it. I can't even find out for sure whether he's Jewish or not, Edwin Gordon. He was a Voice of America correspondent for 25 years. So he was better known as a journalist than as a film writer. But not a lot of details on him that showed up. So, of course, the actors, I mean, there's a lot of people in this movie that you probably recognize. Rod Steiger is under that. We saw Rod Steiger a few weeks ago in The Pawnbroker, and we talked a bit about him then. Was nominated for the Oscar for The Pawnbroker. He won the Oscar for In the Heat of the Night. We'll see him again in a part in weeks. I think we're going to watch No Way to Treat a Lady. So we'll see him there. Of course, he was nominated for an Oscar for On the Waterfront as well. Interesting to know that he turned down the role of Patton that George C. Scott won the Oscar for, and considers that the great mistakes in his career. I was turning that one down, but he said he didn't want to glorify war, so he didn't take the part. He was not Jewish. He grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, though, in Newark. And in preparation for this role, he was originally being thought of it for the role that Maximilian Schell played, but he really wanted the role of the Rebbe. And he campaigned for it, studied for it in a sense. He went to services among the Hasidim in attending services led by Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, the head of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, to try and get the feel and the understanding of what that character might be. Although he did say he picked up the accent from hanging around in a Jewish butcher shop, people in the butcher shop talking. So he picked up the quasi-European American accent that he has in the movie. And then, so he plays Reb Saunders, of course, and Professor David Malter is played by Maximilian, who was not Jewish. So Maximilian Schell was made a career in a way out of Jews and Nazis. And in at least one movie, a character where you're not sure which one he is, the man in the glass booth nominated for the Oscar. He may be a Jew, he may be a Nazi. It's not really clear in the movie. He actually won an Oscar for his first role, which was Judgment at Nuremberg, which I think may be on our list as well this time around. So he won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, I believe, that year. And he was nominated 2 more. He was nominated for the part he played in Julia with Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave. And he was nominated for that movie I mentioned a minute ago, Man's Booth. He was a multi-hyphenate guy in his career. I mean, he wrote and starred in and produced and directed as well. He had at least 2 nominations for Best Foreign Film that he wrote, produced, directed, and starred in. First Love, and the other one was called The Pedestrian. So quite a remarkable career. He even played comedy I mean, he played all the roles, but for me, one of my favorites is the part he plays in a movie with Marlon Brando and Matthew Broderick called The Freshman, which is about uh, young filmmakers at NYU Film School in New York getting involved with a mafia. Marlon Brando kind of playing his Godfather role as an old man. It's a pretty enjoyable movie, and Million Shell has a lovely little part in that. So, um, so Maximilian Schell was actually born to Catholic parents, but they ran away from the Nazis. So he was a refugee as a child. In 1938, they fled to Zurich. He spent the rest of the war in Zurich. So the other main actors that you may recognize, Robbie Benson, who was a bit of a teen heartthrob before this movie. This is sort of a transition for him into adulthood. You can see him sort of the lower row there, right in the middle. You can see that's like as a teenager when he was on a lot of girls' walls in the 1970s. You know, his pictures, cutouts for magazines and things like that. You may be surprised to know that his birth name was Robin David Siegel, born into a Jewish family in Texas. And so he felt role a little bit from his background and said that he wanted to play this role for his grandfather. He, in addition to his work on screen, he's actually made quite a career for himself in voiceover work. He was the voice of the Beast, Disney's Beauty and the Beast, and many other. He's been a voiceover artist in tons of cartoons over the last 20 or 30 years. He's also branched out into direction and has directed more than 30 episodes of different TV shows, some that he was in, some that he was not. So, and he also spends part of his time teaching. He's on the faculty of New York University and also the University of Indiana, where he's teaching dramatic arts in two places. So, so an interesting career that's ongoing. Barry Miller is the actor who plays Ruvain Malter. Also, he had two high-profile roles in 1981. He was in this movie, The Chosen. Also plays one of the high school students in Fame, which I think is maybe that shot on the right there. So if you remember the movie about the performing arts high school. So, but never quite made it, you know, on the big screen. Grandson of Polish Jewish immigrants. And he won a Tony Award a few years later, 1985. He was in the original cast of Neil Biloxi Blues on Broadway and won the Tony for that. I mentioned that Jeremy Kagan directed The Trial of the Chicago Eight and Natty Gann. He cast Barry Miller in parts in both of those movies. So he actually played Jerry Rubin in the Trial of Chicago Eight. He also, you know, if you pay attention, you'll find him in other things. He's in the movie Peggy Sue Got Married, directed by Francis. He's in the movie Last Temptation of Christ, directed by Martin Scorsese, where he plays Jeroboam. He's in Saturday Night Fever as well. Yeah, so Elaine just put that in the chat. So yeah, so you know, a pretty varied career, but not a giant star. I mean, kind of the definition of a character actor in some ways. So the music in this movie is Bernstein. You can hear some of the different klezmer kind of feel that he composed, and also some that he borrowed. in the wedding scene, that's traditional klezmer music. The band that appears in the wedding scene actually has several albums, CDs. They're called Capella, and I've actually seen them perform live. Terrific klezmer band. So that's been around for quite some time, and really sort of in a kind of a klezmer revival in New York City. I was Capella and the Klezmatics were kind of the first two on the scene, and do a great job. So, but and there's also some jazz that I think is credited final credits, but also I think the movie makes really evocative use of both music and silence. Right, music plays and when it doesn't. I mean, I think in one of the evocative touches of this film. So, so of course, what we on screen is this rather narrow segment of the Jewish community. You have the modern Orthodox as Rabbi Ruvain and his father, and the Hasidic community represented by Robbie Benson, Danny Saunders, and his father Reb. So you know, you don't see any Reform Jews in this movie. I mean, it's really a pretty narrow picture, in a sense, of the Jewish community. It may be best exemplified by the fact that when Ruvain and Danny are first talking about how much they study Talmud, and Danny says he can do 4 a day, and Ruvain says, I'm a good student, I can only do 1, right? And, you know, how many kids in of us can do a page of Talmud in a day? Right, it's actually quite a lot. I mean, for those who haven't tried it, to understand a page of Talmud is a big deal. So, it is a rather narrow view, but an interesting view. I think one that for folks like us, and that would involve much of the audience movie. You know, it's not like Hasidic Jews were flocking to see this movie, and probably not even modern Orthodox Jews. You know, so people like us are the audience in a sense, and it gives us a sense that we're wrong to present Orthodox Jewry as a kind of a monolith where all Orthodox think the same. On the other hand, I think the movie is very much about respectful disagreement, and we don't always kind of respectful disagreement across the broad range of the Jewish community. So I was reading one review of this movie. He actually said that his daughter watched the movie. She was like 8 years old. And she said, you know, what's wrong with this movie is that there's too much compassion in it. Okay. So it doesn't necessarily provide a real dramatic arc in a certain sense, because everyone's always trying to see everything from others' eyes in a certain sense. I mean, Reb Saunders is quite open-minded in his way to his son becoming a psychologist, right? You know, perhaps more so than would have really played out in real life, maybe, but you know, this is what they're telling. Their biggest disagreement, of course, is over whether or not the state of Israel can be built by human beings or only by God. Even once that comes into existence, it's as if the disagreement, in a sense, magically disappears, right? Because once the state has been formed, it no longer an impediment to the friendship of Danny and Ruvain. In real life, that's again maybe not quite that. I mean, there are still Orthodox sects in Judaism that vehemently oppose the idea of the modern state and don't accept its existence. Some of them even live in Israel and don't accept the existence of the Jewish state, right? So the fact that again is a sort of a modern touch to Reb Saunders and this was true of a lot of Hasidic Judaism and certainly of the Chabad Hasidim, which the character is loosely based on. That once the state was born, they could stop arguing about whether the state should be born, and they just went on with as they saw it. Um, so let's turn to the movie itself a little bit more and what we see. So similar to the front, it begins with a kind of a montage of sound. Here we don't have image at the beginning of the front. We have, I think someone talked about it like newsreel footage. Here we have radio, just the sound of some to set our time period. So we're set again during, I think, World War II, right? So on the radio, we hear Jack Benny, we hear a speech from Adolf Hitler, we hear Frank Roosevelt, we hear Mrs. Nussbaum. I don't know if any of you remember Mrs. Nussbaum. I mean, the character that appeared on Fred Allen's Alley, right, on old radio. So one of the first sort of, I don't know if it was explicit or implicit Jewish, but a caricature of a Jewish woman, a Jewish mother, you know, who lived in the neighborhood where Allen's Alley took place. So so that sets the stage for us, and then we open up on we see the Brooklyn Bridge, which from the Brooklyn side, which tells us something about.
That's Mrs. Nussbaum,
That's
played
the
by
actress who
Minerva
was.
Pius.
Okay. So
I had never heard of that. So
yeah. Oh, you're still young, Vanessa. Right?
thank you.
Yeah, it takes it takes who's old enough to remember, or someone who was so steeped in comedy growing up as I was to know who Mrs. Nussbaum was. I mean, I had a set of records when I was a kid about the great days of radio, and included Fred Allen and Mrs. Nussbaum. I was a big fan for a little while there. So so we see the Brooklyn Bridge from the Brooklyn side, and we open with a baseball game. And this sort of incongruous baseball game, all Jews, you know, Orthodox, modern Orthodox on one side, Hasidic Jews on the other. And you see this pack of Hasidic Jews in their black outfits, you know, and one of the Orthodox, get a load of them, right? So these are folks who live just a few blocks apart in Brooklyn, but are separated, I think on the Voices, could have been separated by 5,000 miles. Another way to put it is maybe separated by a century, right? But so they come along, and it becomes pretty clear pretty fast that Danny Saunders is no ball. Right? Not only does he have a photographic memory and is able to learn remarkably quick, but he also, you know, excels at anything he sets his mind and body to. So an interesting character. You may have noticed the music playing here. I just want to mention it as sort of a great example of how the movie does this, you know, that comes up to bat and gets on base, and the team starts to hit and run and win. There's all this klezmer music playing in the background, very whimsical kind of scene. And then we get to the moment where Ruvain replaces the pitcher on his team and comes up to pitch against Danny, and the music stops. There's total silence, right? The moment is felt by the absence of the music. I mean, I think it's a beautiful piece of technique on the part of the director. That, and of course, the result of this is a line drive to the face of Ruvain, and out of that, damage to his eye from his broken glasses. That's what they owe their friendship ultimately. Doesn't happen immediately. It takes a couple of visits, and again, the music plays a role in the hospital. Remember that he turns up the modern jazz to drown out Danny Saunders' visit the first time he comes to see him. So it's a very interesting use of the music to talk about to comment in a sense on what's going on in the film. So but they will eventually begin to speak and to become. So so we find out, among other things, that Danny has never been to a movie, even though he's so able, and is hiding out in the library, right? So in addition to his studies of Talmud, he's reading. He mentions, I think, Hemingway and a few other things that he's reading, and of course becomes entranced by Freud, right, in particular. So the other thing it's, in that scene, I think, is that again, Jane puts on some music. This and Danny says it sounds Hasidic, right? And it's actually Ziggy Elman soloing with Benny Goodman and his orchestra. And in fact, of course, Ziggy Elman and Benny Goodman were both Jewish and both were steeped in the tradition. And there certainly is a fair amount in some of that big band jazz going all the way back to the 1920s that really does play an important role in the growth, the birth and growth of jazz in the United States. So it's an interesting meeting place in a certain sense. So I think that's a fascinating thing. We somewhere in here we meet both fathers, right? So we meet Maximilian Schell, who I think we meet him first at the hospital, comes to visit his son after the baseball game, and so you find out that he's a widower and taking of Rouvain on his own, and you know, they have a rather domestic life together, and he is just a modern Orthodox person, but a well-known Orthodox scholar, right? So both of these young men, children of scholars that come at Judaism from a slightly different point of view. Did Nancy, are you saying my Wi-Fi is today? Let me see if I'm on.
I think it's your wife.
It's you, Rabbi, because we can see when it's good. If you look at the bottom near the pin on bottom left, when it's yellow or red, you break up. When it's white, that's good.
Okay, it's white now. So
But it's red now.
Different.
We're missing some of your words.
Yeah, hopefully
Hopefully
this is getting better. I switched networks, so
Ish.
we'll see.
Okay, now
we'll
it's
see.
white. It's good.
Yeah, okay. So sorry about that. So
Oh.
should have done that sooner. So and of course, once they become friends, it becomes necessary for Rouvain to visit Danny at home. So because his father has to approve of his friends, and so we get the scene of Shabbat at the Hasidic family, the rabbi's table. I'm sitting around the rabbi's tish, listening to the rabbi speak, and one of the tests that Danny has to pass every week, right? That his father will do a Devar Torah, say something about what the world, the Torah, whatever, and Danny has to catch the mistake, right? That he refers to the wrong rabbi, sitting around the table. So, but again, I mean, I think it's important to note that Ruvain is no slouch. He also knows that there are things you're supposed to do besides Torah study, right? That prayer and good deeds also matter, right? So, so he passes a test as well, and he and Danny are allowed by Danny's father to be friends. Even though Danny's father doesn't approve of Ruvain's father, um, so that because he writes about the Jewish texts in a scientific, critical way, right? So. So there's a number of things, a number of scenes that are certainly worth pointing out. And I think this idea of Danny being raised in silence is a very powerful part of the story, and certainly worth talking about. It really doesn't resolve itself until very close to the final scene, when we come to understand a little bit more about what Reb Saunders is trying to do, which is not to say that we or the film should condone it, but what he noticed about Danny from a very early age is that he was so adept at everything he set his mind to that he didn't have patience for people who were less skilled than he was at studying and things like that. And so his father tries to give him a sense of humility by raising him with silence. Very and the suggestion in those closing scenes is how difficult that was for the father as well as for Danny. So we also see that the two fathers become sort of father figures to each other's children in some ways. We find out that it was actually Ruvain's father who was the man that Danny met in the library and has been recommending books for him to read, so that they have a kind of a relationship beyond anything that Ruvain knew about. And on the other hand, it's Ruvain who's thinking about becoming a rabbi as the movie goes on, having spent time in Reb Saunders' house, says begins to see the richness of the life of a rabbi. I mean, certainly something I can relate to. But this, there are babies to be named, and of course, in their world, only boys to be bar mitzvah, weddings to celebrate. I mean, those kinds of things. So it's interesting how there's kind of a crossover of the father figure for the two young men, as well as, of course, their friendship. So the movie covers a lot of things. I mean, it's certainly an exploration about Zionism, about Hasidism, about tradition, soul searching, parental influence, pursuit of personal goals, and friendship, male friendship in particular, right? That's a lot for any movie to tackle, I think, in the space of, roughly 2 hours. So there's a lot here. It yields something to multiple viewings. It's maybe not as artistic as some of the films we've seen where we've talked about directors and their composition of shots and those kinds of things, but there in some subtle ways. I mean, I mentioned the music. I think the lighting is another one. You can instantly tell what scene you're watching because of the way it's lit, the way the Hasidic home, which is sort of darker and richer in wood grain and things like that than the office where Maximilian Schell sits and that house, right? There's more there's more light in those scenes and more windows. So it's so that there is a scheme here that the director has created to place us in the milieu as we go through the movie. But there's nothing particularly showy about it, as we might see in something like The Pawnbroker, which I think, in a certain sense, despite being such a small movie, is quite showy in its use of technique. Or even something like Fiddler on the Roof, where we talked about some of the influences of still photography and stuff on the way that movie was shot. The recreation of the shtetl set in Fiddler on the Roof. So this movie is certainly not showy in that way, but it's very professional and well constructed and well put together. So it's really the very rare moment where we see anybody in this movie who isn't Jewish. I think anybody who has any actual part. I mean, I think it's only the one scene where the two of them walk by a few neighborhood toughs who pick a fight with them, and Danny gets a pretty good blow in, to these anti-Semites who are attacking them. So it's other than that, I mean, everyone we meet are the Jewish characters. So I thought I'd throw it open, see if there are scenes or moments or questions, anything that caught your eye or ear that you want to talk about. Anybody?
Hello?
It didn't seem very realistic that Robbie could just leave the Hasidic group and go into the secular world. I can't imagine that that would be so easy for him to be able to do that, accepted by the family.
So on two counts, I think, right? I mean, one is that, that his father is pretty accepting of this. His mother gives him a briefcase to carry his books when he goes to Hirsch College, which, by the way, I think is a mythical place. But it's based on something like Yeshiva University, New York, maybe Gratz College in Philadelphia, both of which would have been familiar to Chaim Patak. So both the acceptance of his family that he's not going to become the next Rebbe, and take over for his father. I think he says 6 generations of the family have been involved. But on the other side of that too, I mean, one of the things that is particularly difficult in the modern state of Israel is that people who grow up in that milieu are not prepared to enter the workforce or to go to college. I mean, those kinds of things. So we certainly have to understand Danny as a unicorn, right? I'm, someone with a photographic memory, as he demonstrates in the movie. It may not be realistic, but there are people like that in the world. So it reminds me of one of my film professors who used to talk about writing screenplays. He said, just because something happens in real life doesn't make it realistic, right? So, our lives are filled with things that, you couldn't possibly imagine, right? But if you try to tell that in the story, people will say, well, that can't happen, right? So it's you could call it a flaw. It's simply the character that we have is truly one of a kind, that he would be able to study all of that Talmud, finish all of those studies in half a day, and then go off and start reading psychology, and then to come from a family. I'd say that there is probably more flexibility there than we realize. In a certain sense, and that you can't really have someone become the Rebbe who doesn't want to be the Rebbe, right? It's not going to work. And his father is wise in many ways, and wise enough to understand that forcing Danny into that mold is not going to work. Very different than the story that some of us watched a few months ago on Netflix, Unorthodox, right? So So you can compare sort of two sides to that story, if you like to look at those two.
Alice, and then Marcia, and then Ed. I also think that that time period, people, both Orthodox Jews and maybe even the Hasidim, were more fluid, and unorthodox shows what it's like today.
Yeah.
Okay, Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to an earlier scene when Danny first goes to visit Reuven in the hospital. I just had, okay, I don't know, how old were they supposed to be? Like 16, 17, something like that, whatever, young teenage men. I was thinking, and I don't know, I wanted to see if this was at all logical. I was thinking that perhaps Danny's father had encouraged him to go visit, because I don't know how many 16-year-olds would take it upon themselves to go visit the person that you hit with the baseball.
Right. So we don't have the answer to the question.
I
So that's breaking up for me.
Yeah, Alice, you were breaking
you
up.
show a different side.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I missed the last part, Alice, but the first part, I mean, we don't actually know.
You're frozen.
Who's frozen? Am I frozen?
No, Alice is frozen. Alice, put your comment in the chat.
You can add to the chat. But
Okay.
but the first part, I mean, so we don't obviously see a scene where Reb Saunders tells Danny to go visit the person he hit, but he may have, of course. And I honestly, I can't remember. I read the book so long ago that I can't remember if there's anything about that in the book. But also I think Danny, being who he is, I mean, has developed a sense of compassion and does know the Jewish law about this, right? I mean, that you're supposed to do Bikor Chalim, you're supposed to visit the sick. And recognizing his own role in this is a very sort of Jewish thing to do, a kind of a heshbon hanefesh. Ruvain says, he didn't just want to hit the ball, he wanted to kill me, right? And Danny kind of owns up to that and says, I don't know why I felt that way, right? I don't know why I had this competitive need, not just to get a hit, but to hit you. Right. And so there's a kind of a meeting of sort of his interest in psychology and his understanding of rabbinic Judaism that brings him to that moment. So with or without his father, I mean, I think he might very well have ended up there. So, but again, he's, from that first question, we're talking about, Danny is a unicorn, right?
Marcia, and then Ed.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was pretty taken with the scenes where Ruvain could not wrap his head around arranged marriage.
Yeah.
And you could tell that he was really starting to like Danny's sister. And, he couldn't stop watching her in the, so I saw that really hit like the difference between the Hasidic and then the secular, that he just had a lot of trouble with that, and kind of reminded me of the scenes in Stranger Among Us, is it, I always mix up the Meg Ryan, and it's not her, it's the other one.
Yes.
But Melanie, but anyway, yeah, where she, at the very end, she said, I'm waiting for my Beshert. And so I thought that was, very interesting scenes. And then the other thing was the conflict between the Zionists and the Orthodox, who said that the statehood would be left to the Messiah. And, I kind of grew up, my mom, I don't know that she was a Zionist, but she was a big admirer of Henrietta Zold and just wrote she did all kinds of research on her and the beginnings of Zionism. So I just thought that was interesting, and the passion that the Zionists had. And when I was in Israel at the museum, I saw the history of the Haganah. So I was really taken too with the death of their friend, because a lot of those kids lied about their age and they died when they were 16 or 17 fighting, for the state of Israel. So I enjoyed that scene where actually Ruvain risked his life to help them, ship the guns.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Ed, and you need to unmute.
Okay, I don't know if anybody else is having difficulty, but all my pictorials of what's going on is escaped. I can hear verbally, but I can't see anything. But besides that, I was getting back to the visitation in the hospital. Judy and I have a 16-year-old grandson, and I think who displays maturity as these boys did, and I think it's very conceivable and probable that one would visit and say, gee, I'm really sorry, or something like that. Also, getting to the part of the small part that Shayna played, the sister, as her mother called her Shandala. It seemed to be an interesting, if not little mild flirtation between Shayna and Ruvain, and I found that interesting and sort of pleasant, if nothing else.
Right. Yeah. So it's another example in a sense in this movie of, it said about this person who said maybe the movie has too much compassion, right? That, once he hears that, she's promised to somebody else, they move on, the movie moves on to other stuff, right? You can imagine, and there have been whole movies, I think, made out of this sort of rebellion against the idea of arranged marriage, which is a path this could easily have gone down, but it doesn't, right? Because everybody ultimately understands each other. So, it presents a kind of a picture that perhaps is too rosy in a certain sense. But I do think that going back to Chaim Patak in the book itself, I think, what we're sort of basing this on, and I think we've heard it mentioned a few times in recent weeks, right? This idea that in the Talmud, we report what all the different rabbis think about something, right? Their disagreements are reported. We talk about the disagreement for the sake of heaven. And this movie is kind of a model of this, that, and maybe you see it most clearly when I think when it's Ruvain's father is talking about Reb Saunders, and gives Ruvain this kind of understanding about that the passion of a Reb Saunders and how important that is. And the fact that the people who followed him, their lives were saved, right? Because they left Europe to follow him to America, right? So having that kind of Hasidic passion saved lives, right? And that it's not something to be looked down on. That's a kind of a remarkable statement of understanding. I think Vanessa's right in the sense that maybe this was more pronounced in the Jewish world in the 1940s than it is today. But it also is part of, this is a pretty narrow segment, right, of the Jewish community. I mean, I'm not sure that either one of these fathers would have that much nice to say about, say, Stephen S. Wise, the Reform rabbi in New York City at that time, who was absolutely preaching a pro-Zionist message all the time. But I'm not sure how much interplay there was between him and modern Orthodox Zionists. I could be wrong. I mean, the American Jewish Archives could help us piece that together. But I think even then, I mean, there were parts of the Jewish community, like the Ethical Humanist Society, that were a bridge too far, right? For to engender that kind of respect. But the respect that they can show between the Hasidic and the Orthodox community, that's more like, Hillel and Shammai in the Talmud. Other thoughts?
Okay, so I put some stuff in the chat. And Rabbi, where did you find next week's movie, The Quarrel?
It's on Amazon, I believe.
Okay. Because I also found it on Vimeo.
Okay.
And I'm going to put that link in the chat. And I did not see it on Amazon. So
Okay.
I checked on Just Watch, and they claim that there's no available stream for the next movie and the one after for the
yeah,
big.
all right. So Shoshana, click on the link. Click on that link. I just started watching it.
Yeah. And the big fix
Right
I
there.
found on
Which link?
In the
YouTube.
chat, Shoshana, in the chat.
In the chat, I have to find out where the chat is. I don't know where the chat is.
So down at the bottom of your screen, Shoshana, there should be.
I'll email you. I'll email you.
Okay, thank you.
The big fix I found on YouTube in its entirety. So,
Okay.
and again, similar to Body and Soul, I think there were 2 versions up there. So one of them looks really good and the other one doesn't. So pick the one that looks good. So, just I see. I mentioned early on, maybe before you got on, that Robbie Benson's from a Jewish family, and he really wanted this part, both because it was a grown-up. He, got tired of playing really in juvenile movies, but also that he wanted to play this part for his grandfather. So yeah, so he may not look as Jewish as Rod Steiger, but it actually turns out that he's the Jewish one. So and so there's a scene right near the end, of course, where Danny shows up at Ruvain's house wearing a secular suit, a gray suit instead of a black one. He's still got a hat on, right? He's not rejecting Judaism by any stretch of the matter. He actually kisses the mezuzah, on the door, right? So he has become a modern Orthodox Jew. Right? There is a sequel to the book, never been made into a movie, but so if you're interested in these characters, you can look up Chaim Patak and find his sequel. I see Julie Schlossberg, your hand's up. Yeah? You have to unmute.
I want to talk about the title, because we know that you think of the chosen, that the Jews are the chosen people. What do you think the title means, though, in terms of this movie? Who was chosen?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of ways to look at it, of course. And of course, part of it is, that this is a story about Jews, and Jews are the chosen people according to our tradition. So that's a part of it. But I would also say that it really refers to Danny Sanders himself, that he is the chosen one, the anointed one, the one who is supposed to take over for his father and become the next Rebbe, right? So he's the one who's chosen. So I would say it refers to him especially and directly. You may also then start playing with it a little bit, and what he chooses is different than what's chosen for him, right? And there's an interesting sort of play on that there. So so he chose something else, right? So that's my sense of it.
Sounds
I
good.
I think there's even a third book. I love those books growing up.
Yeah. What was the
The
do you remember
Chosen, The
what book?
Promise,
Yeah.
and oh, now I'm gonna have to.
I'm not sure if there's a third about these characters, but maybe. But The Promise, that's the
Yeah.
second.
Let's see here.
So I do in a certain way, you know, watching the movie, I feel like, yeah, I'd like to see what these guys become, you know, as one of them becomes a rabbi and the other one becomes a psychologist, and are they able to maintain their friendship? And My Name is Asher Lev is also by Patak, but it's a different characters and a different story, right? Asher Lev is an artist, if memory serves, right? But
Yeah,
also a good book. Right? I'm not aware of any other book by Patak being turned into a movie. I think for the most part, people would find, you know, people who produce movies would find his work too parochial to make that happen. So, you know, and that's sort of one of the amazing things about this film as well, right? I mean, you know, we talked about this when we talked about the jazz singer, right? What producer decided that I'm making the first talking film, let's make it about Jews and a cantor,
yeah.
right? So did anybody decided that they could put enough money into this to make this movie and make a profit on it? Is truly you know, talk about unicorns, right? I mean, you know, I mean, Yentl had Barbara Streisand, you know, Fiddler on the Roof had a track record on Broadway, right? The Chosen was a best-selling book, but it, you know, it didn't sell as much as Exodus or something like that. I mean, and it doesn't have the adventure of a story like Exodus. The idea that somebody decided to bankroll this, you know, I should have looked up who that was, who actually thought this was worth spending the money on, is worth knowing. I mean, that's you know, someone with, you know, and I don't think the movie did make much money. Hopefully, he recouped his investment, whoever he was.
Well, the book was on the bestseller list for 39 weeks.
Yeah. So, and maybe the people who bought the book, you know, went to the movie, but that's a drop, you know, 39 weeks on the bestseller list. I mean, that's a drop in the ocean when you talk about how many people watched something like The Queen's Gambit this year, which was also a gamble. Who would have thought The Queen's Gambit, you know, a TV movie about chess, right? You know, every now and then, and we should celebrate this, right? The Oscar nominations came out yesterday. There's a lot of people who made movies this year that have been nominated that I would say nobody thought those movies were going to be blockbusters, right? That they were going to make these companies billions of dollars like Star Wars or something like that, right? So even the most high profile among them are kind of small artistic ventures in a way. So it's a year to cherish, actually, I think, this weird pandemic year when it comes to movies. So.
And we've all been inside. So this year I've watched a surprisingly number of movies.
So I've seen 4 of the ones that are nominated for Best Picture. I got to catch the other 4. So.
Yeah. There's a few of them that still cost money, like Minari, and there's another one.
The one about the young woman, I think.
Yes, the Promising Woman, or yeah, that one.
Young woman, yeah.
Yeah.
So.
All right, so it's
Nice
the
to see
Quarrel.
everybody.
We'll see you next week. If you have any problems, you can email me during the week. And it's great to see everybody. And we have our regular classes this week, and we'll see you then.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll see everybody. And we have
Right.
classes this week.
Thank you, Rabbi.